Good day, everyone, wherever you are, and welcome to the Emerging Issues in Development Policy webinar series. Today, we have a very interesting speaker at our webinar studios, Bernard Hoekman, the Director of Global Economics Program at the European University Institute. The subject of today's webinar is supply chain and the global trading system. The revolution in manufacturing, increasingly known as the global value chain, has changed the world of trade policy as much as it has changed the global industrial landscape. This webinar will discuss new research suggesting that border management, transport, and telecommunication infrastructure services matter far more than trade-offs. Improving infrastructure and management would increase global GDP far more than the complete elimination of tariffs. However, this won't be easy. Tackling supply chain barriers will require dynamic and responsive national and international trade policy making procedures that are more in step with industrial practices. So, without much ado, I'll turn it over to our speaker, Bernard Hoekman.
Good. Thanks a lot for that. Well, as was mentioned, I'm going to be speaking about global supply chains or value chains, as they're increasingly called, and focusing a bit on what some of the policy implications are of this kind of increasing phenomenon in terms of how world trade actually operates today. Oh, how do we go back? Okay, so I'm sure you're all familiar with the notion of a global value chain, which is essentially the process that firms use to essentially cut up the way they produce goods and increasingly the way they produce services across different countries. So instead of everything being produced in one country and all the inputs for a particular product being sourced from within that country, nowadays firms increasingly source a lot of the labor-intensive types of production parts in some countries and put those together in a second country where it might be processed further, and then it's shipped to a place where the final assembly occurs, and then that product is then shipped to the location of the final consumer. And you can see that in this slide. And increasingly what that means is that if you think about what's going on in world trade today in terms of where the value is being added, essentially a good part of the value of any products that all of you would buy in the store will not have been produced in the location of final assembly, which in trade terms is frequently the origin of the good, but that value added will have been created in other countries, right? So we have a whole series and a tier of suppliers quite frequently that engage and that contribute to the production of a good. And this graph simply just illustrates that phenomenon where we have second tier suppliers, which are in economic terms kind of upstream in the production process, contributing inputs and parts to assemblers in other parts of the world, who then also source themselves inputs from other countries, and then we have the final assembly, final consumption. So I'm sure many of you will have seen these types of graphs. These are simply just examples of how this process actually occurs. On the top left-hand corner, there's the example of a shoe, where we see, and I'm not sure you can read this, but when you download the slides, I guess we can blow it up a bit bigger, where again, a lot of the inputs come from all over the world, and a large part of the value that is actually embedded in the price of that particular shoe really is associated with branding and with the distribution. So all of the kind of tangible parts and inputs into that shoe only add up to about 12% of the value of the good. And in fact, most of the value, most of what you pay for when you buy that shoe in a store is really associated with payment for services, for distribution, for logistics, for transport. And of course, an important part of what you pay for is actually the value of the brand. And that brand, of course, the payment for that brand is essentially a reflection of the research and design that went into kind of putting that shoe together. Top right-hand corner, you have the example of a commercial airplane. We could also have graphs here of the automobile industry or the electronics industry. But again, all of it goes to show that parts and components are being sourced from all over the world, assembled in a particular point of location, and then that final product is shipped to consumers wherever they might be located. Same story with respect to textiles and clothing, where again, a very large proportion of the value of textiles and clothing today is really about the design, about the brand, about the distribution, and the logistics that are associated with getting that product into a store. I'm sure many of you might have heard or read about the iPhone example. I think this is currently probably the most famous example of supply chains at work, where essentially these iPhones or iPads or iPods get assembled in East Asia, quite frequently in China. But again, if you look at what the value is of what is actually being done in a country like China in terms of the labor that is being used to actually put that iPhone together, the assembly, it really accounts for only a very small share of the total price of that particular product. So in this case, it's $6.50 out of a retail price for an iPhone or a production price for that iPhone of $179. So most of the value that is associated with these types of products come from the people who have done the design and done the R&D and who have the intellectual property. But a lot of the value of the specialized components come from countries like Japan, Korea, Germany, and the rest of the world, and not in the place where the assembly actually takes place. So if we look at the dynamics of these global production networks or global value chains, it's been changing relatively rapidly. So initially, these supply chains were very much driven by buyers, by large retailers like Walmart. And it was very much focused on what was happening in East Asia, and although it's not in this graph, in Central and Eastern Europe. Over time, we've seen increasing growth in countries like Brazil, in India, China. We see the number of countries that are participating in these global value chains increasing, and the number of suppliers that are participating in the process also increasing over time. Post 2008, 2009, with the global financial crisis, we're actually beginning to see a change in the way these chains are being structured and organized, and we're seeing a trend which was already prevalent before the financial crisis in these lead firms and these buyers essentially coming to the conclusion that it's very difficult to manage a process where you have hundreds of suppliers located in dozens of countries. So there has been a trend towards consolidation. So the large firms now increasingly prefer to deal with only a few dozen tier one suppliers, and essentially it's left to the tier one suppliers to kind of subcontract with other suppliers. So we're seeing increasing concentration, both in terms of the number of firms that are involved in this process of global value chains, but also in terms of geographical concentration. So supply chains are beginning to become a bit shorter. And in fact, if you look at the pattern of this global production kind of sharing or fragmentation, as it's sometimes called by economists, we're seeing it is very much focused in three regions, in East Asia, in North America, and in Europe. And what we're beginning to see in the last few years is that we're really seeing kind of a bifurcation in the types of global value chains that we're seeing, what is called here the high road versus the low road, and this is very much in quotes, but one where the focus is very much on innovation-oriented, highly skilled types of activities, and the other one which is very much driven by trying to minimize costs, trying to locate low-skilled, labor-intensive types of activities in countries with relatively low wages. This is a slide that comes from Gary Gareffi, who teaches at Duke University and who has kind of long been following what has been going on in terms of global supply chains. So the stylized facts here are relatively clear and I think interesting. The OECD, together with the ILO and UNCTAD, issued a report for the G20, for the last meeting of the G20 leaders, that was focusing on global supply chains. And I think those of you who are interested in this, I encourage you to read that report because it's a very good synthesis of what we know about these value chains and their links to development. And essentially what they find is that countries with the highest rate of increase in participation in value chains experienced growth rates that were 2 percentage points higher in per capita income terms than other countries. So this is a channel through which we can actually increase incomes of people, increase economic activity. But at the same time, another one of the stylized facts is that we see very concentrated use of this type of technology in these three hubs or factories, as they're sometimes called, in Europe, in East Asia, and North America. Supply chain participation and activity is very closely associated with foreign direct investment. Multinational firms account for around 80% of all global value chain activity. And as I mentioned, we're seeing this consolidation within global value chains towards larger firms, fewer suppliers. Now, one of the things that has been happening at the same time in the last 15 years or so is that because of the increasing growth rates in developing countries, and in particular in large countries like China, but also India and Brazil, we're seeing also an increase in trade between these countries, South-South trade. So there's much greater diversity now in kind of final demand in the end markets than there used to be, let's say, 20 years ago. So we're also seeing, because of the rise of the growth in the global middle class, the reduction in poverty around the world, we're seeing much more demand in countries, and that is having an impact on the supply chains, which are then kind of focusing much more around the areas where this demand increase. So there's a lot of implications for policies and strategies for countries associated with this. And I think one of the things I would stress here is that size matters, location matters. So if you are in the middle of Africa, if you're in Rwanda or if you're in Malawi, clearly the opportunities to participate in this trade are going to be different than if you're located in Mexico, which is next to a very large and vibrant economy, or if you're Poland and you're located, within the European Union. And we can come back to that in the questions and answer session. Now, if you look at kind of how important participation in global value chains is across countries, this is a graph that comes from the OECD. And what you can see is the percentage of kind of importing things that you then process in your country and re-export, or exporting things that are used in another country for exporting again within these global value chains. The share of that ranges between 30% and close to 70%. And smaller countries in particular, you can see this on the left-hand side of this chart. I'm not sure you can read it, but we have Luxembourg, Chinese Taipei, Singapore, where you have very intensive participation in these types of global value chains. Whereas larger countries, often you see less of that because more of the inputs that need to be used to produce a good can be sourced locally. One implication of these value chains, and I've already mentioned that with the examples, is that there's a big difference between gross trade flows and value-added trade flows. So it's actually quite misleading to look at what is the value of total exports of some countries, which, take the case of China, is of course very, very big, and the growth has been very rapid. But a lot of the value that is embodied in these products that are exported out of a country like China has actually been created in other countries, and they're embodied in the inputs that are imported in China and that are processed. So this is just a graph that compares China to the United Kingdom, and what you can see is that for the UK, the foreign value-added content of gross outputs is significantly smaller across sectors than it is for China. But what I think is more interesting about this slide is if you compare the dots to the bars, in the case of, and the dots are 1995, the bars are data for 2009. And what you can see that in the case of China, the foreign value-added content of exports has been growing very significantly, right? So that really is a reflection of supply chain trade, importing things that are processed and then re-exporting. And what we're seeing in the UK is that there hasn't been all that much of a change over the last 15 to 20 years. Now let me briefly then turn to some of the policy implications associated with supply chains. And I think one thing that I would stress is that there's much less need for the pursuit of developing vertically integrated industries within a country. So what supply chains offer firms is that they can specialize in very narrow types of activities, which then feed into the process of production of a good within a supply chain without them having to have access to efficient industries locally that produce the inputs that they need to produce their own products. I think another policy implication is that there's a shift from what I've called here a product to a factor focus. You need to really focus as a government on lowering trade costs, on putting in place policies to increase the capabilities of firms, and you need to worry about managing the volatility and adjustment pressures that are associated with this type of trade. And we can come back to that. But issues here, policies relate to workforce development, skills, upgrading to higher value added activities and niches. Another policy implication is that tariffs and non-tariff barriers actually matter much more than in the past from a competitiveness point of view, because you need to be able to import inputs, parts, components in order to be participating in these types of chains. If you put in place tariffs or non-tariff measures, that's going to increase the costs of participating in the chain. And in fact, if those costs become too high, then you're not going to see investments into this type of activity. Another policy implication is that connectivity becomes very much a factor to worry about. So initiatives like trade facilitation, ensuring that we have ICT-related services, that the transport infrastructure is sufficiently good, and that we have efficient logistics in a market are all kind of critical determinants of supply chain participation, because all those things influence the costs of participation. And then a final policy implication really relates to uncertainty. So it's not just the level of trade costs and connectivity costs that matter, it's also knowing what those costs are going to be. And the greater the variance in outcomes in a particular market or a particular trade lane, the less likely it is going to be that firms are willing to actually invest in a particular type of activity in a particular country. So variance, the uncertainty, is as important as the average levels of these types of costs. And a final policy implication is, because of this link between global value chain participation and foreign direct investment, policies really should be focusing on encouraging inward investment by global suppliers and contract manufacturers, but also retailers into a country, because the retailers are, again, they're a source of demand for suppliers locally, and that's one way of indirectly starting to export and participate in these chains. So this is simply a graph that shows you the very high degree of correlation between global value chain participation and foreign direct investment. Now, there's almost a one-to-one relationship there. This graph is simply to illustrate the importance of having kind of low barriers to trade in order to participate in value chains, because again, you need to import a lot of the inputs in order to be competitive. So again, it shows how important imports actually are in exports. So we have here two examples: the electronics industry and the transportation equipment industry. So think about cars, trucks, and again, you see very large shares of foreign content being embedded in the exports of these goods. And again, so given that the foreign content is very important, that's all being imported and processed. If you increase the cost of that content by imposing barriers to trade, you're going to be much less competitive, and at some point, firms will simply not invest in this type of activity. This is simply another kind of illustration of this graph. This shows you the use of intermediate inputs that are imported into a country, into exports. And again, what you can see is that in large countries, to reiterate the point I just made, that's relatively low because you can source many of these inputs locally. But for smaller countries, Korea, the Czech Republic, Hungary are examples here. You see that the share of intermediate inputs in total exports is very high. One thing that I think is important to stress, and that is coming out of a lot of the work that is being done in terms of mapping these value chains, is that services play a very important role in this whole process. So again, if you look at things from a value-added point of view, a lot of the value that is embedded in goods that are traded today really reflects services. Everything from research and development to design to transportation and distribution. The average across the group of countries that I've put up here in terms of the value added embodied in exports is something around 45%. So services, therefore, are an important part of the equation because if your services are either not up to scratch or they're high cost, it's going to be much more difficult to participate and to be competitive in this type of trade. Now, that's not something which is supply chain specific. This is also something that is more general, but it simply illustrates the point that from a policy point of view, you really need to think about services and the efficiency of services in your economy as a determinant of the competitiveness of firms in your country. One of the things that is coming out of a lot of the research in this area is that this connectivity issue is very important, and it really reflects the need for firms both to have kind of secure certainty in terms of how long it's going to take to move goods back and forth across their supply chain and the cost of doing that. This is an example, and it's probably a bit too detailed, but it comes out of a report that was done by the World Economic Forum earlier this year, where they're looking at specific sources of supply chain barriers that raise costs. And this is simply what happens for a firm which is located in Mexico and is in the electronics business, how long it takes that firm to actually get things into Brazil as opposed to into the United States. And this is, a measure of days required for brokerage and customs clearance. And you can see that on average, it takes 20 days to get consignments into Brazil, as opposed to just 1 day into Mexico. Now, independent of how big those costs are, or the delays are, they translate into costs, right? And what type of costs are there? Well, you need to maintain more inventory. You have the cost of financing all of these delays. There's depreciation associated with those goods being stuck. So there's a whole series of costs that are associated with this. And at the end of the day, of course, if those costs are too high, it excludes a country from participating in a particular chain. And of course, consumers end up paying more for the products. The potential gains from reducing these supply chain barriers are very large. And I think here, one thing I want to stress is that when we're thinking about global value chains and participation in global value chains, reducing the costs of using these things is actually quite important. So what this graph does, and again, it comes from the same report of the World Economic Forum, it compares what would be the real income gains of getting rid of all remaining tariffs around the world relative to actually reducing the real trade costs of moving goods across borders. And this is associated with these types of customs delays, but also inefficient transportation services and things like that. And essentially, it's an order of magnitude bigger. So what the left-hand bar shows you is an estimate of what would be the real income gains of reducing the level of supply chain barriers around the world, just halfway to what we observe in the best performing countries. And what you get then is an increase of global GDP of 4.7% relative to eliminating all tariffs, which gives you 0.7%. Now, I don't think these precise numbers are not something that to focus on, but I think the real issue is what is the difference in terms of the potential gains from actually dealing with and reducing real trade costs to allow greater participation in supply chains relative to the type of thing that trade negotiators are focusing most of their attention on, which is tariffs and traditional barriers to trade. And basically the payoffs from focusing on real trade costs are much higher. So briefly, what are then some of the implications of this phenomenon for trade policy? And I would argue that we really need to focus much more on reducing non-tariff types of policy measures. We need to focus much more on services and the ability of firms to actually get access to efficient services. And I think one of the big challenges for governments is how do you actually go about doing that and moving forward? And what I would argue is that we really need to focus much more on cutting across the different, what I've called here, policy or regulatory silos. So it's not just enough to focus on what happens in customs or what happens in the area of road transport. We really need to start thinking much more in terms of supply chains, because the supply chain focus can help us identify what are the sets of policies, the bundle of policies that together actually reduce the efficiency of global value chains in a particular country, but also ultimately impede investment into that type of activity. So I think using these supply chains as a focal point for a discussion to actually think through what are the policies we should be focusing on and what do we need to worry about is something that isn't done enough, and that could be very productive, especially in terms of attracting investment and therefore creating employment in this type of activity. So one way to do that is to kind of use some of the standing bodies that many countries already have that brings together regulators and economic policy officials, but to bring in the stakeholders much more into that process. And in particular here, I'm thinking about the business community because they actually know where the sources of costs are coming from. So you need to bring them in to actually identify what are the various policy determinants of these types of costs. I think it's very important in this context to kind of be as specific as possible and to have baselines and to agree on specific performance targets so that we can actually measure progress in terms of improving policies from a supply chain efficiency perspective. And here, I think there is also an opportunity to use data that is actually generated by businesses every day as part of their operations as an element for actually monitoring performance and outcomes that are focused on trying to help improve the operation of these global value chains. Firms know what goes on in customs. Firms know how long it takes for them to move consignments from A to B, and I think there's a lot more that could be done by governments to actually try and harness and harvest that type of data, working with the business community to actually help them understand much better what the impact is of policies and policy reforms on the operation of this type of trade. Now, this is a non-trivial exercise. The World Economic Forum report I mentioned earlier tried to get into that to some extent, and I think one of the preconditions for moving in this direction is actually to try and identify relevant data that is already being collected by businesses. If you ask businesses to go and fill in surveys and generate new data, that of course is costly. So I think the more we can rely on metrics that are based on data that is already being collected, the easier it's going to be to do this. I think another constraint, very briefly, just to mention, is you need to agree on processes and to have an intermediary to actually safeguard the confidentiality of the data and to ensure also that it's accurate. We can come back to that in the question and answer session. I think these are general types of prescriptions that governments can pursue themselves, but I think there's also a lot that could be done in the WTO to move in the direction of actually trying to identify what are the key policy areas that impact on participation in these global value chains. If you think about what is being discussed already in the WTO in this area, many of the things that matter are already there. So I think, again, this notion of trying to cut across the various silos in which these policies are being discussed would actually be useful. So again, to take a supply chain approach, which might actually then kind of increase the priority for services or border management as opposed to focusing as much as has already been done to date on tariffs. I think there's a lot that could also be learned from what is happening in regional contexts. So the EU and the US have now trade agreements with Korea. The EU has just concluded a new agreement with Canada. We have ongoing discussions on the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. All of these are kind of new so-called 21st century types of agreements, which are supposed to come up with kind of dealing with these types of regulatory ways of dealing with the regulatory policies that segment market and that increase supply chain costs. I think for the WTO, that means given that countries are going down this regional track and not doing this in the WTO proper, at the very least, the focus should be on trying to understand what is happening in these agreements, use the trade policy review process in the WTO to focus more on what are the interactions between policies on the supply chain front. And I think more generally, I think there's a case to be made for thinking a bit more creatively about using the WTO to actually pursue multilateral agreements that would focus on improving the efficiency of supply chains. I'm kind of running out of time, so I'm not going to go through the details of what this might be. We can come back to this in the question and answer period. But I think one thing we could potentially think about is why not have a supply chain agreement inside the WTO among countries that are interested in kind of improving the efficiency and the operation of these global value chains. I mean, the WTO is a very flexible instrument, so in principle that should be possible if countries actually want to go down this particular track. I think that was all I had, so let me stop there. Okay. So let me just go through some of the questions and comments that have been made so far. So one is a question by Jeroen Haver on, will the global factories not all move to the south in the coming decade, say to Latin America, South Asia, Africa? And I think that is likely to happen to some extent, but I think where they move and how they move is very much going to be a function of the ability and the focus of governments to actually put in place the preconditions for these supply chains to work. If you look at what is happening in Latin America, on the trade cost front, for example, I think if you talk to the business community, they would say, well, operating Brazil is actually quite a high cost type of exercise. Same thing in South Asia, where we have very high trade costs, internal transport costs, and the same thing, of course, is the case in Africa. So I think where these chains would move as real wages in China and in East Asia more generally rise, and it becomes much less competitive for them to actually do the processing activities there, whether they go to Africa or they go to South Asia is going to depend very much on the preconditions that are being put in place by governments in terms of reducing these costs. I'm just reading some of these questions. Sangeeta Raja asks, in this current environment of high risk and poor quality, how does one improve the trade issues, but also address the quality aspects, especially in the food chain and in the pharmaceutical chains? I think this is a very important and very practical question, and I think here we have an example where, again, I think my sense is that quite frequently the firms are ahead of the governments. So if you look at what's going on in food, for example, and you think of how much focus is actually being put by the companies on putting in place private standards to actually ensure food quality, my sense is that quite frequently that's actually more stringent and tougher than the mandatory standards that are being put in place by governments. Pharmaceuticals, I think we have a big issue with respect to, well, there's different issues. One is, of course, price in terms of how expensive certain drugs are as a result of intellectual property protection. But there's also been quite a bit in the way of counterfeiting and very bad quality drugs being brought into markets. And I think what this illustrates is, again, the trade-off that exists between the need for actually controlling imports as they come in, but also not doing that in a way that you actually stop these chains from functioning in the first place. So I think there very much is a trade-off. One point on food, I think one area in which there's a huge potential to actually enhance food security as a result of improving the efficiency of these supply chains is by reducing food waste. So there's been quite a bit of research that has been done over the last couple of years that actually tries to track within supply chains, how much of the food that is produced and that is actually taken off the farm actually ends up in a retail store. And the answer is that quite frequently, relatively little of what is actually produced ends up being available for consumers. And the reason for that is again, because of bad logistics, because the supply chains are not very effective. Mostly these are issues that happen within countries or within regions. So it's not so much on the international like that this happens. But I've seen estimates of post-harvest food losses on the order of 30 to 40%, a large part of which is really due to inefficient supply chains. So if we could improve the efficiency of the supply chain by putting in place kind of a policy environment where food can move much faster, where it doesn't get stuck at the border and rots, we actually would also enhance food security. There's another question that asks, you mentioned having specific performance targets to benchmark and measure progress in supply chain efficiency. Do you have specific examples? There are examples out there. I'll just mention one. If you talk to the express companies, the FedExes, the UPSs, DHLs of the world, this thing is going to sleep. One of the things they do to measure the performance of their own supply chains are something they call holds. And a hold is a consignment that has satisfied all the regulatory requirements. So import duty has been paid, it's been inspected, it's met the quality standards, if there are quality standards, etc. But it's simply not moving. And if you look at that data, which the firms have and which is not publicly available, but I would argue should be made publicly available because it can help monitor performance, you see huge variance across countries for the same product, but you also see a lot of variance across customs border posts within a country for the same product. So that gives you kind of real world information, and this is data that is collected on a daily basis as to where things are stuck, where things are not moving in a particular border crossing. So again, there was another question about more examples of the type of data. So I think this customs holds is one. I think another type of data that would be useful, and again, this is going to be sector specific, but it's the number of regulatory agencies that need to sign off on a particular consignment entering a country, and getting a sense of the different dimensions of this. So do they actually communicate and cooperate with each other? How much is there redundancy in that type of certification that is required? And so forth. So again, these are examples of data that all exist within companies. What are some examples, this is a question by Parul Agarwala, of landlocked countries that have been able to integrate into global supply chains? And then in parentheses, low-income countries. And I think that's an important parenthesis because, of course, we have examples of landlocked countries that are very much integrated. Think about Switzerland in the European Union. But I think if you're really landlocked and you're far away, the same thing would go for island economies. Ultimately, to get integrated into supply chains, a lot of the exports that are going to enter into that supply chain are going to be indirect. So we're really talking about suppliers providing things to firms which are located closer to a port. And I think one of the reasons we're not seeing a lot of supply chain trade in regions that are low income is, again, I'll reiterate what I said before, it's really because of domestic transactions costs that are very high. I think in India would be an example. Again, we see the same thing in Africa, in Latin America. So I think the point is that currently we're not seeing a lot of that happening because these costs are so high. So I think in order for that to happen, we're going to have to reduce the trade costs that are associated with activities in these types of countries. So I think it's a bit of a chicken and an egg. We're not seeing a lot now, but it's reasonably clear why we're not seeing that. But I think the potential is certainly there, given, again, these rising real wages that we're going to be seeing in China, East Asia. So that type of trade there's going to be, certainly on the supply side, demand side, there's going to be an incentive to move that to other countries. Question by Julie Mapp. Would the services aspect of GVC show a different geographical distribution to that of the actual physical good, given that there are fewer border restrictions, increasing use of the internet, and so forth? I think that's interesting question. There's been relatively little work done on services supply chains per se, and I think one of the problems that we have is that increasingly the distinction between a service and a good is becoming quite blurred. We know that a lot of the value added, if not the majority of the value that is embedded in goods, are services. So in that sense, there's a very direct connection between the pattern of global value chains of products and services because they're very much tied to each other. But at the same time, we're also seeing increasingly services being provided independently. So there are kind of value chains now for services. Business process outsourcing phenomenon, of course, is a very good example of that. And there, of course, we don't have border restrictions in the sense that these services are using ICT technologies to get into markets. But we do have other types of restrictions because quite frequently to do this effectively, you still need to move people around. So we get into visa regimes that restrict this type of trade. But I think increasingly what we're going to be seeing is more of a pattern that we can actually digitize products and trade those kind of directly through the internet. And then indeed we are going to see potentially significant changes in the way these value chains operate. One thing that certainly the logistics providers have been thinking about, and I think will continue to be thinking about, is what are the implications of technological change? And again, this digitization process is one source of technical change that might have implications for how supply chains work. I'm sure many of you have heard of 3D printing or advanced manufacturing, where essentially the idea is you don't really need to move goods around anymore. You have a machine in your office or in your home where you push a button and the shoe pops out or the t-shirt pops out and so forth, which all sounds like science fiction, but those machines already exist and are being used in research environments. And if that actually becomes commercially viable, clearly that is going to have implications both for the design of supply chains, but it would also mean that a lot, again, of what is actually happening is going to be trade in services, because essentially we're talking then about the digitization of a lot of what is now happening in terms of actual physical trade. Do I scroll down? We're at the bottom. Yeah. Okay. So I'm seeing everything there is, right? Yeah. Any specific ways to integrate sustainable supply chains while promoting trade? I think there's lots of specific ways we can do that, and I think we're seeing that happen a lot. Certainly, and there's different dimensions of that, of course, both with respect to kind of the inputs of commodities and natural resources into supply chains that are dependent on those inputs, but we're also seeing it on the distribution, transport, logistics side. So if you think about movement of containers on ships, there's this whole process of so-called slow steaming, where essentially you can ensure that goods actually get from A to B at a certain point in time, right? So everybody knows it's going to take X amount of days to get things across the Atlantic. And what the shippers have discovered with the transporters is that whether that's 28 days or 26 days, at the end of the day, doesn't really make a whole lot of difference, but by kind of extending those extra 2 days actually result in a very large reduction in the use of fuel in those ships. So that's an example of kind of enhancing the sustainability of this type of trade on the transport side. But I think what we've also been seeing from a sustainability point of view, if we define that more in terms of environmental footprint, carbon footprint, one of the drivers for this shortening of supply chains that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that we're seeing, kind of more geographic concentration, is also partly a reflection of an effort to try and reduce the carbon footprint of what is happening. Just to give you one example on this, different types of technologies can also have a big impact in terms of sustainability. So there are companies now that are producing products in China that are no longer using air freight to get those to Europe, for example, and have shifted to rail. And again, I think this is an illustration of the importance of getting this connectivity dimension, improving that, because in principle, given that there are railway connections from China all the way to Europe, those were never really used very much because there were all these problems of getting across the borders, right? So trains had to be stopped in each country. You couldn't guarantee that a train could be packed somewhere in China and then move without ever stopping to Berlin. Well, today that is the case. So I know there are large electronics companies today that use these trains to get all of their laptops and computers from China to Europe. And one of the reasons they're doing that is very much because of enhancing the sustainability of their business model, reducing their carbon footprint. Obviously, it's going to be a lot less burdensome on the environment to use a train than to fly your laptops around the world or to fly them to Europe using air transport. So that's an example of this happening. I think the interesting thing in terms of these types of anecdotes and cases is that this is all very much being driven by the companies themselves. They're not being forced really to do that by government policy. So again, it's an example where in some areas I think the business community is actually ahead of the policymakers on these types of questions. So another question, what about the current trend of goods customization, like customized shoes, electronics, etc.? How does this affect specialization and capabilities of the manufacturers and the flexibility of the supply chain? Well, I think they're all examples of how flexible these supply chains actually are. And again, it depends on what type of product we're actually talking about in terms of how feasible it is to kind of tailor and personalize particular products. It's more an issue of actually how you design your production platform, your production chain. But increasingly, because of the ability of this flexibility that exists in terms of producing goods, you can actually tailor products much more easily. I think it doesn't really affect specialization per se. It's really more an issue of technology in order to be able to manage the process of allowing consumers to tailor the things they buy and having a production system that actually ensures that the product they get is actually the product they would want to do. Jeroen Haver asks, can you name the firm that is shipping its laptops by train from China to Europe? Well, I guess it's not a secret. It's Hewlett-Packard. That's the one I know, but there are other examples as well. And I think a good place to look for these type of examples is in the World Economic Forum, because that's where I actually get these examples myself on this. Question by Luti Ojo. Most government policies use tariffs to protect local industries where there is not export input into the process. And again, I think this is an example of where we have a chicken and an egg type of problem, because if countries do this, that also means that firms in those countries do not have access to the imports that presumably might be much more efficient, lower cost, higher quality than what is available locally. So I think here there's really a trade-off that government should think about in terms of how likely is it that that type of industrial policy will actually generate input industries that can compete internationally. And here again, I would argue that size matters a lot. So if you're the United States, of course did this in the 19th century to good effect. Other countries have done it as well. But I would argue that the world really has changed in that regard, and that by not engaging in this supply chain type of trade and allowing firms to specialize in the things that they can actually do competitively, essentially you're reducing the ability of countries to benefit from these types of specialization in supply chains. And and this is very much an ongoing argument, and different countries are pursuing very different strategies to this effect. I think if you look at a country like Brazil, it's fair to say that there's much more of a focus on trying to actually develop industries along the lines of import substituting industrialization, trying to attract investment into the country, which then sources locally. And I think potentially a country like Brazil can do that. I think it is a high cost type of strategy. But if you're a very small country, you really can't do that. So there it is very much more of a function of reducing these trade costs, improving connectivity. So I certainly agree that governments certainly still use policy to protect local industries, but I would argue that increasingly that is something which is not going to bear fruit in most of the instances in which this is being pursued. So I think I would argue the opportunity cost of that approach is likely to be quite high. So Yu Cheng Zhen notes that streamlining regulatory processes is very important, but there are also certain requirements that are necessary for sanitary, phytosanitary measures for food safety. So are there any potential best practices that countries could follow to shape their legal and regulatory framework? I think the answer to that is certainly yes. Um, and I think the key thing here is to really ask yourself, to what extent are these measures being applied to actually help achieve health and safety objectives? And then given an answer to that question is, are there other approaches that could be used in terms of ensuring compliance with these standards that are lower costs? And I think here, one of the things I would argue is that quite frequently countries appear to just be adopting technologies and procedures off the shelf. And quite frequently, those are costly. To take the case of, let's say, dairy or the dairy industry, where we have very different techniques that are used around the world to ensure safety of milk products, but quite frequently what a country might do is to say, okay, I'm going to adopt the procedures that are used, let's say, in the European Union domestically, when what that does is actually increase costs so much without really improving safety that it's actually going to be excessively costly. So what I'm saying is that there are different techniques that could be used. So in dairy, for example, if you compare Indian approaches to European approaches, which both achieve the same objective in terms of health and safety, the Indian approach will be much less costly. So why not adopt what is being done in India in the area of dairy, for example? That's just an example, but I think you need to ask these types of questions. So in terms of good practices, I think that is something to really think about. I think it's often not so much the standard per se, but it's really the technology that is being used or required to certify compliance with those standards that is a problem. Okay, so we're running out of time. So last question. Will the concentration of GVCs into big firms lead to problems of price control, political control, or monopoly? And I think that's a very good question, and I think it's a very valid question, and I think it's a question that has been underemphasized in this literature, certainly as far as the economists are concerned. Just based on the stylized facts, given that we have a very small number of very large firms who control many of these global value chains, I think it is something to look at carefully. And I think there are some rules of thumb you could use to try and identify where there are potential areas where we really need to look carefully as to how competitive these particular markets are. If the end market is highly competitive, so if we have retailers like Walmart and Carrefour and Tesco, Metro in Germany, and so forth, competing for these types of products, and there's a lot of competition in the final market, then I would argue there's probably less need to worry about what goes on inside these supply chains from a competition point of view. Insofar as you don't have that type of vigorous competition in the end market and you have more of an issue of potential monopoly power, I think it is something we need to look at. So I would argue, coming back to the WTO dimension here, I think we really do need to be thinking much more seriously about international rules on competition to ensure that we actually don't end up in situations where small countries really can't do a lot about the behavior of these lead firms because those lead firms are located in other countries. So that's an area which that's a kind of an example of an instance where you need to think about international cooperation. So I think concentration is something we need to worry about more probably than we do at the moment, but I would also say it's very much an empirical question as to how important that is, and quite frequently we really don't know what the answer is, so we need to do a lot more looking in that area. I think we're out of
That's
time.
it.
Yeah, that's it.
Well, thank you very much, Bernard, for this interesting presentation. I'm sure that the audience enjoyed the presentation, and based on the number of questions you had, the audience really enjoyed the opportunity you offer them to ask you all these questions. Sadly, we don't have more time to keep discussing about the topic, so we have to conclude the webinar.
Okay. Thank you.
For for all of those who couldn't see the entire presentation or to of the open question section, we want to let you know that in 24 hours we will publish the entire recording of this webinar in the E-Institute website. That's it for today. Thank you very much for your assistance and hope to see you all of you in our next webinars. Please take 2 minutes to answer a few questions to let us know what we can improve in the webinars